This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Juliette Kayyem is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security and is a national leader in crisis management. Whenever a massive event happens that impacts people's lives, whether it's a natural disaster or a human-made one, it's critical that local, state, and federal first responders are able to create and implement effective strategies. Before Juliette was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, she was the first ever Undersecretary for Homeland Security in the state of Massachusetts. So she's an expert on how the country plans for and responds to disasters across regions, across levels of government. In her new book, Juliette lays the groundwork for a new approach, highlighting certain leadership deficiencies that we need to overcome, including real-life examples from the California wildfires, the Boeing 737 MAX, and other recent crises. If you want to learn more about Politics and Media 101 or hear past episodes, please go to our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode coming this Friday. Justin Higgins and John Gunnison led this interview. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
So, Juliette, I think it's kind of remarkable that you've been focused on this issue of disaster preparedness and disaster response right as the U.S. government and all governments all over the world are coming out of the most extraordinary and most remarkable disaster that really any of us can remember. And that's, of course, the pandemic. And so I'm wondering, did your work on this project kind of run in parallel to the pandemic? And was it so strange watching all of that unfold at the same time as you were immersed in the issue of disasters?
That's such a great question because I've been in the field. I'm not young. I've been in the field for 25 years. It's changed. My career has changed. I was in counterterrorism, and now I'm more in, like Justin certainly knows, like in terms of all hazards. So I think about climate change and cyber, and in terms of response, and that's my focus. So the threats will come and go, and some will be, more likely than not. But I really think about response and preparedness. And so I had been thinking about this book for a long time. Also, the other side of it is I didn't want to write, and I don't know if anyone wanted to read a pandemic book. Like, I don't know about you guys, but like I have not picked up any of those books. Like, I was writing throughout it. I'm a frequent contributor to The Atlantic. So it wasn't that. It was just like I sort of felt like there wasn't a story to tell. But the story I wanted to tell came to me through the pandemic. It's how I opened up the book. I think it's a telling story. I'll tell the quick version because I think it just shows also this the recurring nature. And the theme of the book is, all these disasters are different. And of course, right, each one is tragic and different. But if we look at the commonalities, we can do much better when we can learn to fail safer. That's the theme. How do we fail safer knowing that these disasters are coming? And that honestly is the story that got it going. Was we had damage in our house. Some of the damage exposed what we thought was crawl space. And fast forward a little bit, that crawl space, after we examine it, has a photo. I put that photo, old photo from the early 20th century. I put that photo on Twitter. And when Twitter does good, right, that's compared to when it does bad. And within 15 hours or 16 hours, we learned the story of the McHugh family that had lived in the same house. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there's just like very old rambling houses that have had like different lives, some are boarding houses, some are whatever. Now it's single family. And the McHughes had lived here in 1917 to 1919. And I learned through the Twitter genealogist that room was what's known as essentially the sick room or the infirmary room, that their 19-year-old daughter had died in the third wave of the 1919 pandemic. Because there was no vaccine, you really had to isolate them. She passes away in there. And I, at the stage, had a 19-year-old daughter. And I'm, honestly, I'm stuck in the house, but I'm busier than I've ever been because of the nature of my work, because I'm advising on response planning. And it was just like this moment where, these two mothers in the same house, separated by 100 years, and they have to send their daughter upstairs. She dies. They close off the space. And then in a pandemic 100 years later, a mother who's also a preparedness and Homeland Security expert home with her 19-year-old daughter. And it was that moment when it literally happened within 24 hours where I just thought, all these things I've been thinking about, that just about these commonalities. And I think that gives us agency. right? I think if we think of them as like separate, we'll just be like, oh God, that thing. And then that thing was what started me writing. And so there's a little bit of pandemic, but not a lot.
So this could be a pandemic question, or it could not be, because it's really about globalization. So we are a very globalized world, and specifically the US and China are very intertwined. We have obviously a competition going on between nations. During the pandemic, it became very clear to everybody that probably isn't in DHS that we do have a critical supply chain issue where medical materials like masks and PPE are largely produced overseas, if not China specifically. So the question here is, and it could be maybe we have a conflict with China in the future, does the Defense Production Act actually work in a globalized world? And if it does, should there be anything we should be aware of in how we implement it?
No, it does. I mean, this was one of the big things I was pushing for in like January to March of 2020. So I'm going to make it clear to listeners, I'm just consumer of intelligence. I don't pretend, I was never been a spy. I've always been, you receive it, you're reading it, you're kind of not second guessing it, actually. You're just assuming that, and then you're sort of figuring out, okay, what should the response be? And I do that in government. I do it for the private sector, I do it for my family, and I do it on air. And I first heard of COVID January 4th, and it was the strangest way. And this is all open source. Remember, I'm like teaching and doing media stuff. Like this is not rocket science, but it was an interesting article that was weird, like in the sense that the hairs on the neck go up. It was about China getting sort of consistently more nervous about this thing. I don't even know if it had a name. And had called in the WHO, but was insisting that no one was dead. And I was like, well, that can't be. The China would never call in the WHO. And then, of course, you start to hear more. And then you're watching China and Wuhan, whatever, like, lockdown, and everyone's like, oh, that's so interesting. And then you're watching Italy, like, get to its knees, and everyone's like, oh, that's so interesting. And like, a whole bunch of us in the space are like, this is more than interesting. This is damage. And I say that only because I view January through March as the squandered months. Like, in other words, there was going to be a death toll, and it might have been 200, 300, 400,000. But if there was anything you could have done, it was to utilize the Defense Production Act to get, honestly, stuff, I was going to say the 4-letter version of that, stuff moving.
You can speak French on this
moving.
program.
But my mom might be listening. So, to get stuff moving. And so the Defense Production Act, I have to be clear, is because people have this like total, I think coming out of the Trump administration, this like totally weird thing about it. So one thing is, like, the world is complicated, and to just be like, oh, big bad business has to be forced to do it. Actually, the truth was if you tell business there's a market, of which there would be, because the government's a great market, they'll make it. Like, trust me. What they don't want to do is build a bunch of masks and have no one buy them, right? But if you say, under the Defense Production Act, you switch, you make masks, and we will buy 2 million of them, you've got like capitalism, like whatever that is, like 101. The other is that they have to price it at the fair market value. So it's not like cheating, right? So it's like, and so all of this could have been done. And the number of anecdotal stories I heard, and I think that they were reinforced in the media, of like companies being like, we're making bras right now, we can make masks. Should we make masks? Why is no one returning our phone call? And if you would utilize the Defense Production Act, you would say, hi, bra making company, make us 1 million masks instead. We will buy them at fair market value. You will have a guaranteed market because no one's buying bras anymore, right? No one's and
no one's leaving out of their houses.
No one's leaving out of their house. So that's the way to think about it, is that it actually, if utilized, ends up satisfying both, right, the supplier and the demander. And so it was so frustrating because the Trump, I honestly to this day believe that Trump thought it was a taking, that he thought it was like, we can't take from these companies. I honestly think he didn't get it.
Well, he wasn't the most policy oriented guy, so he probably just had the talking points just sink right into his brain there. One follow-up question there is, in a disaster, not singling anybody out, but like with COVID, for example, initial reports were maybe we didn't need masks. We maybe didn't know how effective masks were. And it came out later that might have been messaging due to a very real concern where our doctors and nurses, I was living with a nurse, she had to take a KN95 mask write her name on it and use it for a full week, right? So how do public officials, or how should they, looking back at the mask messaging early on, how should they balance telling the truth and maybe not telling the full truth because of public safety?
So I've been very, very critical of public health comms, and I talk about this in my book about communication. I think public health faltered the most when they gamed the system. I do. If we need masks, you say we need masks, because I think the market would have heard that, right? And then you would have had some really interesting, I mean, look at all these people who got into mask making and stuff, right? Like, so instead they game the system so that they become, they knew at the stage, I knew at the stage it was a respiratory disease. And once again, I'm not a doctor. Like, I'm just reading this stuff and looking, right? I mean, I remember the moment where I thought the world is different. I was in California in late February. So I'm still traveling into late February. And people know San Francisco is a hub for China and others. Honestly, everyone from China or Japan or anywhere in Asia is masked, and all the Westerners are not. And you're like, okay, well, something is wrong here, right? So that was one period. Another period where I thought, where they were like gaming the system, was, remember when the vaccines were slow in coming out? So they do these millions and millions of clinical trials. They tell us it's safe at 2 doses, yada, 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 right? We're all, okay, we're going to get. Then there's like a little interruption on supply chain, which anyone in disaster management knows. It takes a while. Everyone take a deep breath. We know how to move stuff in this country. Like, we do. Like, honestly, it's like the one good thing we're good at. Like, and that the system would work itself out, and that eventually you would have supply overwhelm demand, which really did happen by essentially June, which is really incredible.
Say, it was very early, right?
It was very early, but we had those panicky few weeks in February, March. So then all of a sudden, the public health professionals become logistics people, right? And they're gaming the system. They're going to, well, maybe it's okay at 1 dose. Maybe it's, and I'm like, shut up. You told us 2 doses. We want people to feel safe with this. So I think that only honesty works, because dishonesty will come back to undermine the credibility. And I think we're seeing it now. I think the public health communications have been so bad because, let's just be honest here. I mean, honestly, like, as we always are, but like, I want to know 2 numbers. How many died today and how many of them were unvaccinated? Why we don't lead with that. Meanwhile, I have to be so nervous about infections because that's the only number I'm hearing. But infections aren't, for the most part, right, going to impact most of us. So that if you get everyone freaked out, then you can't focus your efforts on the immunocompromised, the young, those that you need to protect. So I don't know. At some stage, infections did not become relevant to planners. And what became relevant was the one thing I worried about the most, which was, are my death rates getting too high?
So, Juliette, you've been talking quite a bit here about all the different reasons why public authorities might be dishonest. You know, they might be trying to game the system, trying to play economists with supply and demand. They might be trying to avoid panic. Another reason is even more simple, which is that people in positions of public trust want to put forward a sense of confidence, and they're not often willing to acknowledge the vulnerabilities, especially people who are up for elected office. They want to show that they're in charge and everything's under control. And I think that this is particularly dangerous because it leads people in public positions to underplay the specific vulnerabilities that need the most attention. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've seen across some of these other cases. Maybe we'll leave the pandemic behind from now on, but is that, this issue of bluffing and exuding confidence and minimizing vulnerabilities, is that something that's gotten people into a lot of trouble?
Yeah, no, I think it has. And I actually think that the conventional wisdom is actually being challenged. I mean, I think that the idea that bravado will save your life is, in the end, I think was rejected. However popular Trump may be, even though I think that's questionable. I mean, let's just not forget, like, close to 80% of eligible Americans are vaccinated. They're not boosted, but they're vaccinated. Like, for all the stuff that you hear and the bravado about, independence or whatever, or like whatever these people, like, for the most part, we have a consistent 20% group of jerks, right, in this country, right? Like, I mean, I'm talking about eligible. This is not. So, and I think Also, I do think like Governor Abbott in Texas, same thing, where you come out, you talk about the first responders and how fantastic they are and bravado and whatever. It's gonna hurt you rather than saying this is an utter freaking tragedy and nobody should be happy today. Nobody, right? Like this is everyone's fault, but including. So what I've discovered in disasters is what the public actually has come to accept. So maybe I'm too optimistic about the American public, but I actually think it's true. And we'll see this play out in hurricane season, is two things: numbers and hope. The best crisis communicators are those that are providing sort of factual numbers of sort of what the heck is going on. Like, how many levees are breached, how much water is here, how many dead this, how many destroyed that, like whatever. And, this was Andrew Cuomo's success, also his failure, but his success, but also Bobby Jindal, governor of Louisiana. Seriously, type in on YouTube, Bobby Jindal hurricane. Like, he was freaking fantastic. Like, he literally and then there's 18 fire trucks. Then the other is hope, which is you tell them where you are and you tell them what you're going to do to make it better. And I think that that's really important too, that fatalism, without giving them hope out, actually is not that productive. And you look at the polling, for example, on guns. There's a perfect example in which the vast majority of Americans, close to 90%, do believe something can get done. And I think, going back to that is the purpose of studying disasters, right? And studying the story of disasters that we don't often hear about, right? What did in fact work? We always look at what didn't work, what did in fact work. And the reason why we study them is because you can give people agency. And, if you give them hope, they'll feel like they actually can do something to protect themselves. So whether that's being utilized or not, that's sort of the most successful aspect of crisis communications.
The former governor of Puerto Rico that I worked for could have used your advice there because he did not do nothing against him. Yeah, didn't do the hope part or the accurate numbers part. He was fibbing about the death tolls until we had to go to Harvard. But anyways.
Justin, I think that's really important to say because I write about Hurricane Maria and, everything that went wrong. And, it's sort of like in some ways a precursor to COVID. Like when you think about sort of what he did with the governor and the mayor and stuff and making it personal, right? There's we say a joke that there's no I in crisis. Of course there is an I, but it's a joke. It's there's no I in crisis. It's just not about you. People are mad. I tell my students if you want to go into this field, your goal cannot be to keep your job. You will get fired. And once you accept that, then your standard operating procedure isn't to protect my job. And I think that's really key in terms of sort of, stepping outside yourself. But I think Maria is so important because, and this is true of COVID, Maria is a perfect example of what we call stupid deaths. The Hurricane Maria death toll is not about the hurricane. It's about Maria. It's about everything that was wrong in Puerto Rico before, the distribution of energy, the critical infrastructure, its political status as a territory, the fact that it's Spanish speaking, right? That had something to do with it.
Ports got congested. There weren't enough drivers.
Exactly. Everything. And a lot of those people could have lived.
And the sad thing, and let's move to Maria, then we'll move on to the other topic. So the sad thing or the interesting thing maybe for people that weren't dealing with Trump directly, at least, or advising the governor like I was trying to do, was we had to ask for money from the U.S. federal government directly to Trump. Trump was saying a lot of racist things downright. He was throwing paper towels at people, but because of the power that Trump had, the governor couldn't attack him or try and coerce him into doing better immediate disaster response. He couldn't criticize FEMA. He could not even come close to criticizing anything with Trump because we were asking for $94 billion. And Trump was the type of guy who would say, F you, you're not getting a dime. But moving
or his son-in-law who gets away with everything.
Yeah, his son-in-law with Saudi Arabia, that's a whole nother issue. But with Hurricane Maria, we saw FEMA. You touch on FEMA in the book. It was recently updated massively after Hurricane Katrina, but FEMA is a framework, maybe you can get into a little bit, where essentially the state or local or territory officials request things from the federal government, and the federal government reacts as a support system. In the case of Hurricane Maria, for a variety of reasons that you mentioned, structural with energy and weak infrastructure, just no institutional knowledge despite tabletop exercises. You just had state officials or territory officials, they were locked in their houses. Telecommunications was down 98% through the island, where they literally could not respond to request things from the federal officials. So does FEMA in the structure where it's state and local first, then to federal, actually work? Or do we think it needs to be updated?
Those are sort of traditional federalism notions, right? Local response, state coordination, federal support. Does that work for big disasters? So I think it depends. I mean, on the first part, in some ways, you can't fix our governance structure through the disaster framework. Because the 10th Amendment in the United States delegates public safety and public health authority to really the most basic local level, right? You have a city police department. You look in Texas, that you're not going to be able to rearrange that simply for a disaster management framework. So what we have to get better is really, so it's always going to be first responder. And to remind people, most disasters really can be worked out with, federal support. The feds know how to get 18 helicopters from the Defense Department to Oklahoma or whatever it is it needs. FEMA is I call it a 1-800 number. It basically knows how to get you federal resources. There's only about 4,000 or 5,000 people that work at FEMA. It's not an army. It's an access point to the federal government. And so I think then what we have to focus more on is two things. One is sort of unity of effort we still struggle with. And I think who does what well. And the challenge with COVID was because you had a 50-state disaster, because you had the first disaster in U.S. history in which all 50 emergency operations center were activated. You couldn't use all the other mechanisms that one uses, like mutual aid, to support each other. And Puerto Rico found itself like that because it's an island. The other is, so I sort of accept the governance challenge, and for all of its flaws, it's worked pretty well. And I think what you have to do is work on unity of effort. And then the other thing is what we're discovering is because of movements in disaster studies, including something called, Don't Tell the Republicans, Critical Disaster Studies, which is really looking at how we're defining response and recovery and even what a disaster is. If Hurricane Katrina had hit a different city, would the impact have been the same? Like, in other words, we're calling them disasters because what was already there was so feeble. And it's really gotten a lot of people, even like me, I don't agree with everything about it, really to open up and think about issues around equity and access and community engagement that's, I think, much better than your traditional chain of command. So one of the stories I tell in the book, I have lots of feel-good stories in the book too, is what happened to Occupy Wall Street. It didn't go away. It had to go away because people will remember this was a big progressive movement about income inequality. They were protesting the big banks down on Wall Street, intense. And like my parents would have said, they're ne'er-do-wells, who are these people in sleeping bags on Wall Street? They turn around, they get evacuated because of Hurricane Sandy. And then as the government realizes that they are younger, more nimble, more diverse, have more accessibility to communities that governments tend not to, including immigrant communities, can work it, so to speak. Basically, FEMA turns Occupy Wall Street into what came to be known Occupy Sandy. And it's now renamed something else. It's Citizen Corps, but it's just a new and much more engaging way of thinking about disaster management, which is it's not just the locals in terms of public officials. It's actually communities that are it's their community. The Occupy people are going to know their community better than someone who doesn't understand the racial differences, the economic differences, or language differences.
No, that makes sense. And Puerto Rico is an extreme case because, like you mentioned, the disaster framework works well because normally the capital of the state or the other part of the state isn't totally wiped out. I just wanted to pick your brain on that. What happens if we have a tsunami, God forbid, hit Hawaii? What should we use that same framework even if the locals can't respond, right? Should we call in the military?
I do think in some instances, when you say call in the military, I would never sort of say military in charge. I think in terms of predicting what I said were stupid deaths, right? The deaths that did not have to happen, the people aren't stupid, did not have to happen, but for the lack of response, that we should just assume stupid deaths and surge resources. This was really Craig Fugate's idea, is that, go big or stay home. And I really think that that's right. And I think we have to get to that in these cases, that you're just not sitting back. We're about, hurricane season starts tomorrow, and we already have a hurricane. We already have Hurricane Agatha.
I think it's the biggest one to hit Mexico this early in modern history since we've recorded it, right? So moving to preparedness with Hurricane Maria, for example, I believe just a couple months before the hurricane hit, there were tabletop exercises. So everybody should have been prepared. Yet when the hurricane hit the island, for example, it was a disaster. And I'm not just blaming FEMA. There were territory and local officials that just didn't know what to do. For example, one story is FEMA, who leads or works in tandem during these tabletop exercises, was sending sat phones to the island of Puerto Rico because, for the listeners, literally 99% of telecommunications were out. So that means the governor can't talk to the mayors can't talk to their staff, the staff for the mayors can't talk to the hospitals. Literally, it was a blackout where the office in DC with 6 people that I was working in was the governor's office, coordinating with the White House and everything like that, which should never happen, right? The governor should have an open line. So FEMA was going to fix this, and they wanted to send sat phones over to Puerto Rico. They sent sat phones, but ultimately they sent them to the wrong satellite network. So these sat phones could not work. I'm not sure how public this information is.
I've never heard this before.
But it's a true, I swear to God, cross my heart, this is a true story, where they sent Puerto Rico the wrong sat phones. I think it was, 4 or 5 days a delay, because we had to figure out that they were the wrong ones. We had to figure out what the mistake was. This was all while the initial response center was being set up in the stadium there in San Juan. So we didn't really have any recourse. That is to ask. We see that FEMA did the tabletop, but yet they weren't prepared. The local officials did the tabletop. They weren't prepared. So when the shit hits the fan, whether it be a hurricane or an earthquake, how much value are in these tabletop and preparedness exercises? And do people just forget what to do? Like, why aren't they doing the right stuff a lot of the time?
So first of all, yes, I'm a big fan of these tabletops, if nothing more than they just familiarize people. And remember, the people at the tabletops are also people who are not necessarily first responders. So I am a big fan just to routinize at least a process. So a couple of things is, one, they do go stale. And so part of my message in the book is, if you have a world of recurring disasters, right, the devil never sleeps, right? But the second part of that line, because I'm quoting someone in the book, she says, the devil never sleeps as she prepares for more tornadoes in Joplin, Missouri, a place that got hit horribly in 2011. The devil never sleeps, she said, but he only wins if we don't do better next time. And so if you have a philosophy of sort of perpetual preparedness, you're not thinking about, oh, I got to go do this, the ups and downs. That is actually the way you're thinking. But you also, Justin, raised an interesting point of, because part of what the book is I just want people to familiarize themselves with this world that you now know what it is, right? I mean, sorry, Mom, we're living it every day. Like, I don't, as I said at the beginning of this, it's very hard being me and being in this field where you realize your relevance is just, unfortunately, just when everyone is just horrified, which tends to be like every other day now. So we are used to after action reports. So we have the training before, the after action reports later. I think one of the most interesting fields of which we can learn a lot from technology, biometrics, AI, whatever, is learning in the thick of it. That actually ends up being one of the harder things, is how are you acquiring information, whereas you certainly know information is all over the place, and then adapting to it, or adapting the plans to it so that you can respond. And there's a lot of really interesting literature in that. So it's worth looking at, I think, because I think that's the next stage, because these are longer term disasters, communications go down, basic things aren't learned. There's no reason, right, if that happens with FEMA, that can't get fixed. Like, right, I mean, if someone's realizing it really early on, but we have these, mechanisms of fixing things that take way too long, and we have to learn to be able to pivot in real time.
I mean, you've been in disasters. I don't want to use an uncouth term. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Like, you had FEMA yelling at Puerto Rico yelling at FEMA. I'm yelling at the USDA. They're yelling back at me. And everybody's just trying to do the right thing. It's just, like you point out in your book, The Devil Never Sleeps. if you're not prepared, you don't know what to do, and it's just not going to work. So I want to hit on something that you mentioned a little bit earlier in our discussion about Puerto Rico, hurricanes, equity and access. So as global warming happens, I think that most everybody can agree, the storms are getting worse. Like you mentioned, we already have Agatha, which is the worst in recorded history. But what makes these disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes, all of the earthquakes worse is when you don't have proper infrastructure that has been hardened and proper mitigation techniques have been employed. So when an area gets hit, how should we be rebuilding that area? So with Katrina, we just rebuilt it right there. With Puerto Rico, they're trying to improve the electricity grid, which for people who don't know, the power lines were literally a concrete box with a wooden telephone pole that you could just push over, and you could knock that over before the storm came, and that would just remove power for a whole neighborhood. So when we're investing these tens of billions of dollars in Louisiana, Texas, Florida to rebuild, what should the focus be to prevent the next disaster from being as bad, like the theme of the book is?
In some ways, I want to push back at the question, not because of you, but because part of the theme of the book is I'm not the past person, like how do we stop bad things? And I'm not the future person, the resilience person. I'm the you are here person. Like, you're here right now. The boom hits, the disaster hits, and what are the 8 lessons we can learn from history? I don't mean that. But obviously, as we respond and recover simultaneously, our response will be better the stronger we are. So there's a couple of things I mentioned in the book. So the first is obviously using the tools of government to recognize what is happening in the world. And that's taxes. And what do governments do? They tax, they penalize, they make it a crime, they zone, they insure. And I mean, literally, of that list I did, we're doing everything wrong. And this is a consistent against Democratic Republican governments, right? It is the thank you, ma'am. May I have another philosophy of disasters, which is, Justin, something happens to your house, or John, something happens to your house, and, oh, we're so sorry that happened. Here's a check. Why don't you build like as it is, right? So part of it is just stopping them, but also you can't live here. We're going to zone away from this. So that's like the first thing, is using the tools we have, right? And that includes the private sector. That includes like insurance. Like, I'm not a fan that the private market always knows what it's doing. But if the private market is telling me they're not going to insure a certain area, why the heck is the government stepping in to do that? Like, I mean, really? Like, why doesn't the government then spend those funds to, and this is the second part is, I think part of it is that we're going to have to really think strategically about managed retreat, which is why doesn't the government spend that money in what's called managed retreat, which is we are going to now use funds of which you thought that you were going to go back to normal to actually pay you to retreat. And this is in fire areas, flooding areas, and coastal areas. And this is why climate change and climate disasters are going to be so different for us in the future, because they really are going to change the way that we think about how we live.
So, Juliette, talking about the role that the private sector has to play in disaster preparedness and response, it makes me think also about the role that the general public has to play. And it seems to me that one of the biggest ongoing challenges here is building a shared recognition of threat. And that many of the threats that the government or many members of the public might see as very acute, something we need to prepare for, like climate change, like, for example, the threats to democracy, like terrorism. Not everyone in the public has the same idea of the severity of these threats. So a big part of preparedness is convincing more and more people in the public to take the threat seriously and getting them to come on board and build a bigger consensus. And I'm wondering, I mean, this is $1 million question, but have we identified any actually effective techniques for communicating and convincing people of these shared threats and getting more people on board and getting closer to a consensus, which is necessary to prepare for disaster?
I actually think we have. I mean, if you think about hurricanes, if you live in the Gulf of Mexico, or I grew up in California, you're acclimated to a way of thinking about a risk and you're preparing for it. So, we always prepared for the big one, an earthquake. I mean, I grew up as a prepared. I mean, I got nuclear bombs under Reagan and earthquakes in California. Like the idea that like you were going to be blown up to smithereens, like we were raised this way. Like this is like normal for us. So part of it is we can do that, right? I agree with you, though, that I think we are so bad at risk calculation. We just are. And people can pretend like we're not. Like, look, we know what high probability, low consequence events are, right? Fender benders. I know those. So like, that's easy. Like, okay, I can insure for that. And I know what we call low probability, low consequence events, right? It's like, I'm not going to worry about those because they're unlikely to happen. If they do happen, they're not a big deal. I call these the selfie stick deaths, right? I'm not going to line an entire safety apparatus around worried about a couple dozen people a year who die because they're, taking pictures over a cliff on Instagram. I feel bad for them, but I'm not going to. But so then I think that the only thing that we should be talking to the American public about, and this is where the book is not the risk, but the consequences. What are the consequences for, and the high consequence aspects of this, right? I'm going to worry less about low and high probability and worry a lot more about high consequence. Because if I focus on high consequence, I'm about 80% of the way there. And that is what's the tagline of the book is learning to fail safer, not safely, not safe, just safer, right? So that if I'm measuring success, my measure of successes are things less bad than they would have been because of my investment. Is 200,000 dead in a pandemic good? Yes, if my comparative is 1 million, right? In and of itself, it's horrible. And so that's how I've come to overcome this issue, which is because I think we're horrible at it. Americans are horrible with risk calculation. Almost every country is, actually.
Well, Juliette, talking about our efforts to avoid these really high consequence disasters that might not actually happen, it reminds me of another one of the major concepts in your work, which is this idea of the preparedness paradox, which is that sometimes when we do such an excellent job of averting a disaster, it almost makes it look like there's nothing to worry about. We were talking about this before, me and Justin, and we were talking about how many of the great disasters that have been successfully averted, the public might not even know about them. I mean, it's not necessarily just stuff like Y2K or Ebola, where we were banging the drums and then there was no disaster, but people were aware that there could have been a disaster. It's things that never even made it to the public's attention. And this reminds me a little bit of a field of work that I know that you have a lot of experience, which is terrorism risk management.
The preparedness paradox is if it's so obvious, and so what the book does is it tells stories about when preparedness works. So we focus on Fukushima because that was a disaster, a nuclear facility that had radiation leak because of an earthquake and a tsunami. We don't talk about Onagawa down the street that didn't have that because they were prepared to fail safer, right? So what is that about? So it's called the preparedness paradox, which is the more you invest in preparedness, the less bad the result will be. And then people will say, why the heck were you so nervous about it? So the best example, of course, is Y2K, right? Is everyone's worried about the computer shifting from 1999 to 2000, and they shift and nothing horrible happens. Some things happen because the worry was that the computers wouldn't interpret the 19. Well, that wasn't luck. That wasn't because they overestimated. It was a couple $1 billion invested globally, invested in get your computers prepared for the year 2000. But then everyone looks back and the narrative of Y2K is everyone freaked out. That was such a nothing. Well, it was a nothing because of the investment. So it's going to be a persistent challenge. And I think the only response is consistent preparedness, is to see what I do in the book is have basically eight lessons that I tell through stories, is to see the commonalities, right? And that we're not going to view disasters as surprises anymore. The word disaster itself is about surprise. Dis is not bad, and then aster is star. So it's viewed as a misalignment of the stars, right? That this is like, the somehow we're at the mercy of these things when we can actually assert agency over it.
So you mentioned funding and helping prevent it. And John and I were just discussing terrorism and counterterrorism with each other before the show. I'm wondering, so a lot of money goes to counterterrorism funding. Is there a ton of terrorist attacks that are averted that the public just doesn't know about?
I wouldn't say a ton. I think there's a lot more dissuasion, disruption than we know about. And part of that is hardening targets. Part of it is shaming it. I mean, I think this has been one of the challenges with the rise of white supremacy and it being nurtured by the Fox Newses and the replacement theory is that you're not shaming it anymore, right? And then, in other words, I think there was a shaming aspect to it and an isolation from society simply saying no more.
Now it's a permission structure.
Yeah, exactly. I always say Nazism didn't go away. It just became unacceptable for a long period of time to act that way, right? And so, but I think it is right. I mean, I think that there's a lot more, there is a lot more disruption that's going on, but not of the 9/11 type, but still of the type that, would change people's lives.
So a couple last questions here before we wrap up about Uvalde and the attack that happened at the school. So for starters, I know we don't know a lot, so I want to just pick up on what I think is a talking point. We're seeing a lot of GOP senators like Ted Cruz, members of the House, point to the silver bullet solution is one door. I saw you on Twitter say that was stupid. So, not in so many words. You went and explained why it's stupid, but could you explain why that is stupid? And then the follow-up there is, do you think these people are being advised by disaster experts like yourself, or do you think this is just a talking point to get away from guns and move on?
So anything that can be not about guns, so it's going to be about the bad response or the teacher who didn't close the door or the school safety guy who wasn't there or the door. So this is just basic planning is, sorry to be crude here, but so we call them kill spots for a reason. And that is the reason why you don't want people congregating behind a specific space is because they become easy targets. So if you did only one door and someone wants to kill you or get in, you're now just going to have easy targets on that side. So just as a factual manner, this becomes relevant, right? Because we're like, let's just be realistic here. Like there's actually people who've thought about planning and flow. Part of why I try to have the persona I do. I'm very, I have obviously strong, is just to say, look, I'm going to take them at face value. And as a security professional who thinks about risk reduction and flow, I'm telling you, having a designated kill spot where you're going to have 100 kids on the other side of a single door, right? Which then ignores whether he can't shoot himself through a locked door or a window. It's just ridiculous. Plus, life is offsetting risks. Can you imagine a school with a single door? I mean, kids are going in and out and they're yelling and it's fun and whatever, and they're going to go do this. And then the high school's got 18,000 spaces and it's not going to happen.
I mean, it seems very clear to all of us what the real problem is, of course, which is the access that terrorists and violent people of all kinds have to firearms in this country. But in the absence of any action on that point, one thing, Juliette, that we've all gotten so accustomed to in our efforts to prepare for these tragically predictable and repeated attacks on schools is the process of lockdown drills. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether this is a valuable use of time, whether it's just security theater, whether we're traumatizing or making young children more afraid to go to school by doing this. Because you study preparedness and the effect of training, do you think that this is worthwhile? Are these drills that every child who's grown up after Columbine has gotten used to, have these actually helped save people and prevent even worse disasters? Do you think that this is a good use of time?
No, I think that the data, and I've changed on this, I think that the data is clear that the emotional trauma of them is probably too great for certain kids. And then you can actually talk it through without having to drill it about what they're supposed to do. I think teachers need to be trained because I think they're going to be directing kids, especially younger kids. And obviously police officers need to be trained. But also I'm much more accepting. I mean, I think because I've seen the changes in disaster management, like that things will change, right? I mean, that things do change over time and that what was once acceptable or common, look at Columbine, what was once standard operating procedure, you wait for the gunman, right? Is no longer. I'm now that way with active shooter drills too. I think the data is clear.
Well, I wish we could have ended on a more upbeat topic.
We will, because I have to say,
okay.
I think it's important that people, I mean, this has been such a horrible time period. I mean, and I just think if I can do anything, it is like we do have agency. And I know everything feels like we're just at the mercy of just these forces that are horrible and awful and whatever, but we do.
That concludes today's conversation. Again, huge thanks to Juliette Kayyem and to you for being here. To hear past episodes or sign up for our email list, which will deliver our best of directly to your inbox from time to time, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode coming this Friday. This has been Politics and Media 101. Wherever you are in the world, thank you very much for being part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founders, Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, we hope to hear from you soon.